Steyn. Join me as I do interviews with leaders in the field of artificial intelligence from across the world. We speak about the business relevance of artificial intelligence, and we also speak about the future. Is it to be feared or to be embraced? Please subscribe at my website for updates on future interviews. Today I have the privilege to speak with Sean Culey in the United Kingdom. Sean is a business transformation expert. He is an award-winning keynote speaker, and I am reading his book at the moment called Transition Point: From Steam to Singularity. I attempt to read a book a week on artificial intelligence and how it will impact our lives. And I can honestly say Sean's book is one of the best I've ever read, and I highly recommend it. I will add the link to the book in the comments below. We had an amazing conversation, and I invite you to listen to what we spoke about.
Sean, it's lovely to see you. I want to start off by saying how I realized that you are somebody I need to speak to. There's the amazing book cover behind you. So I was browsing through Amazon. I try and read about a book a week if I can. I often do it in the car on audiobooks. And two things really drew me to look at your book. The one was the amazing cover. The second one was the word singularity in the title, which is something that I am very interested in. And we'll talk about the book as we go, but I absolutely love the book. I'm about halfway through it, and I thought this is one of the people I absolutely have to speak to. So, Sean, thank you so much. I think if anyone asks you, like in a lift, so what do you do for a living? How would you answer that question?
That's a good question. I think my children ask me that all the time, to be fair, and I never really have a very good answer for them. What do I do for a living? I mean, I'd spent a lot of time talking about disruptive change and the impact that disruptive change is having on businesses, specifically things like supply chains. Do a lot of work around the supply chain area. Currently, I'm working with the Association of Supply Chain Management on improving supply chains out in Africa, specifically in Nigeria, for malaria, HIV, soon to be COVID-19, also tuberculosis. But really, my focus is on transformation. Initially, it's been around a lot around sort of business transformation, supply chain transformation, but a lot more people are approaching me to help them and discuss, just how to transform their the mindset of their organisation to take advantage of this, ever increasing wave of technological change and the impact that's having on their businesses, but also on the economy and society at whole.
Okay, doesn't sound complex at all.
Yeah. So, I do a lot of speaking, a lot of keynote speaking. And obviously, the pandemic's impacted that quite significantly, as you would imagine. And I do a lot of international travel, which again has been impacted. So, but that's generally what I spend a lot of my time doing, and writing, of course.
Yeah, yes, and I heard something about a second book in one of the podcast interviews I read about. So we need to get to that at some stage. You have a great website, by the way. There's a lot of great information on there. I've listened to some of the webcast or kind of radio recordings that you've done, looked at some of your talks, so it seems like you are quite in demand. And like you said, it's not, luckily we don't have to jump onto planes at the moment, and with layovers and hotels and things like that. It just seems that we can do a lot more interaction at the moment and adding value to webinars and things like that. So Transition Point, let's get to the book. What I love about it, and as I said, I'm only halfway, but I read a lot of books on singularity, artificial intelligence, especially books around the business impact. I love the fact that you start not with where we are now and where we're going, which a lot of books do, and that's very relevant. You really go way back to give the context of how we have undergone change as a human species, and especially since the medieval times and so forth. And like you say in the introduction, I think you didn't set out initially to write such a comprehensive book. No. You must have done a heck of a lot of research. I love history. I read a lot. I learned so much, and I think it's such a worthwhile read to give people, or for people to gain the understanding of why we are experiencing the change in the way that we are now. So maybe for a minute or two or three, let's just talk about the book. So talk us through that book, and especially I like the historical angle on it, especially.
Yes, it was very interesting. I mean, as I say in the introduction, initially that wasn't the book I set out to write. In fact, initially I was going to write quite a relatively short book, based around an observation I had that there was a series of technologies that were all emerging all at the same time. And everyone was talking about each one of those independent technologies, big data analytics, cloud computing, certain elements in robotics, autonomous vehicles, drones. And I would see all these, and each one, people were talking about each one of those. And I thought, well, what happens when they connect? What happens when we bring these together? Because when we look at the supply chain, we end up connecting and automating, the end-to-end supply chain. And no one was talking about this. So I wrote a few articles at the time around that, started to speak on the subject. And it really resonated quite hard. And I thought, there's a really good book in this, and it's hot right now, so I'm going to write this book. So I spoke to my wife and I said, I'm going to take 3 months off work and I'm going to write this book. And she quite skeptically looked at me and said, okay. And as I went into it, I thought, well, really what I'm talking about is what is happening. But it doesn't really explain why it's happening. And in fact, I don't know why it's happening. Why, I worked through the 90s and the 80s, and we didn't seem to have the sort of period of transformation that we were going through right now. So, it's interesting to write about what's happening, but really the more interesting question is, why is it happening? And those 3 months were completely spent just on research into why it was happening. And I ended up spending the next year realizing that I was facing a really big piece of work here. And then I thought, well, even understanding why it's happening doesn't really answer the real question. The real question is, so what? What does this mean? Where's it taking us? And I spoke to the publisher at the time and said, look, I'm doing this work, but it's turning into quite a big project. And they said to me, well, why don't you split it into 2 books? Why don't you do sort of one book up until the financial crash and then one book moving forwards? And in fact, actually, that's exactly what I did to start off with. I wrote the first book predominantly on the historical section, so it was a lot thicker than the part 1 is in the book right now, and a lot more detailed. And then, of course, the publisher came back and said, well, actually, this doesn't really work because you're always alluding to a future that you have to go to the secondary books in order to find out. So I stepped back about 2014, thought, no, I really want to do this justice, and I've got to connect the dots. My raison d'etre, if anything, is my ability to connect things. I don't think I'm particularly the best at any one single thing, but I'm quite good at being able to see connections where others struggle. So I really wanted to connect the why with the what, and the what with the so what, and where's it taking us. And of course, when I was speaking about this subject, all the time I was writing this, I was still continuing to talk. The questions I was getting from the audiences were never really about technology. And very rarely were they questioning technology. What they were questioning was, the economic and social ramifications of it. What does this mean for the future? What does it mean for capitalism? What subjects should my children study? Am I going to be in a job in another 5 years? What happens when robots do everything? So the questions that were being asked were much bigger and much more macro in scale than just simply a discussion around supply chains, for example, or technology and supply chains. And it really came into sort of like a passion project. I wanted to understand what's happening right now, why it's happening, and then lead us to where we could go. Now that makes it quite a big project, but I'm also very aware that I don't think I've ever come across a book that's been able to do that before. So my 3-month project, as I promised my wife, turned into a 6-year writing project, of which I probably had to take about 14 to 15 months off work, just in pure research and of it. So it has been quite the life investment, I must admit, in order to be able to connect these dots. And even since then, I've seen a lot of the stuff that I write about come to fruition, specifically in the third part of the book. I'm constantly being contacted by people that say, you wrote about this, you told us this was going to happen. So I'm now working on a revised second edition. So effectively, I've been working on this since 2012. So it's a good 8 years worth of research and blood, sweat and tears and quite a bit of money, to be fair.
Yes, amazing. I want to get to you speak about the 6th wave in the book.
Yes.
Explain to us what that is and why is it important?
Well, again, I really needed to understand why throughout the history of humanity, from all the great civilizations and all the great empires, actually, if you looked at sort of the KPIs of success for us as a species, nothing really changed. The great religions rose and falls. We went through past civilizations like the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians and the Roman Empire, and they collapsed. But why 250 years ago did the curve of human history just suddenly go from a very linear progression in terms of population, all these KPIs, into an exponential upswing? And of course, the one thing that happened there was we industrialized. We learned how to take the forces of nature and turn them into energy. And that allowed us to sort of break the Malthusian constraints that held us back as a species. We were always limited by our food supplies. We were always limited by the forces of nature. Now we suddenly began to understand how to control them. Since then, we've been able on a very exponential evolutionary path, but it's not linear. One of the things I learned was it's not linear, it's cyclical. And in fact, it's the cyclical nature that gives it its permanency. If we look at other societal models that haven't been based around sort of free market economics and technological change, like communism, it becomes very linear in nature. It becomes very staid. It doesn't evolve. So it doesn't have these forces, what are called creative destruction. Now, creative destruction is a term that was named by an Austrian economist called Joseph Schumpeter, who picked up a previous Russian economist called Nikolai Kondryav's work, who was tasked by Joseph Stalin, believe it or not, to actually prove that the Great Depression represented the end of capitalism and that communism was the future. And Kondryav who came away and he said, I don't believe that to be the case. I believe that actually what happens is capitalism comes in waves, hence the sixth wave. And at this point in time, we've just seen the collapse. The Great Depression represents a collapse of the third wave. And I think it will rise again and rebuild once the debt and the bad debts and all the bad industries have been cleared away. Now, of course, that wasn't the message that Stalin particularly wanted to hear. He wanted to hear that, communism was the future and capitalism was doomed. So he had Kondryav sent off to the Gulag and finally executed. And his work was buried, but it made its way into the hands of the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter. Schumpeter said, Kondryav is right. In fact, capitalism had wheels again. We moved into the sort of fourth wave. But the one thing that Kondryav didn't understand was, why did it happen? And Schumpeter said, well, actually what's driving this is the entrepreneur and the innovations he creates. So it's the actions of what he calls new men and new women now, we should say, creating new industries and new ideas that ultimately destroy the old ones, but move society forwards, move the economy forwards, move the humanity forwards in this wave-like cyclical manner. Now, what I did in my research was found that actually what there are is a sort of three called the macro techno-economic paradigms that happen at each one of these waves, which is new communication mechanisms, new transport mechanisms, and new communication transport, new power sources. And when they combine together, they create whole new industries. But in doing so, they generally destroy the old way. So the automotive industry destroys the buggy whip and the buggy manufacturers and so on and so forth. And each wave moves us forward. Now, what happens is the upswing of the wave, which takes about 2/3 of the wave's length, and each wave is about 50 years long, is driven by this new creation and the new industries. Then things adopt and diffuse across the marketplaces. And ultimately, what happens is there becomes less and less money to be made out of these new industries because they're now very mature. Investment moves to easier vehicles, which are usually financial vehicles. So they move to property, they move to financial vehicles like subprime mortgages, for example, which overinflate, finally crash. The wave collapses, as we saw in 2008. And then investment moves back into all of these new ideas. So what we've got right now in the sixth wave, because we're now in the big start of the sixth one, is investment moving into artificial intelligence, into robotics, into autonomous vehicles, into renewable energy, into things like the Hyperloop. So we have now investment driving that next wave of techno-economic paradigm shifts.
Do you think it's the last wave?
Yeah, yes, I do. Because I think what will happen is we have a subtle difference in this wave than we have in the previous waves. In every other wave, we've replaced jobs. And what we've done when we replace jobs, we create new jobs. So we don't light, we used to have an army of people going around lighting lights with whale oil every night, but now we have electricity. We don't need to do that anymore. But what we have in this wave is something subtly different. We're creating machines that don't just replace jobs, they actually replace human capabilities. And in fact, they're increasingly getting better at that. So they can see, they can hear, they can speak, but they can do it better than we can. They can see things we can't. They can translate multiple languages all at the same time. They can answer any question that's been asked of them. And we're just at the start of this curve. So another 10 years of development, and we're able to develop machines that ultimately learn from each other, all connected to the cloud. And then it gets to a position where you go, well, what jobs are left? And the jobs that are left are those that, effectively the machines can't do. There'll be things based around creativity, human empathy, around manual skills like plumbing and electricity and maintaining all of the existing infrastructures that we have. But all of that sort of repetitive rules-based work that actually employs millions of people right around the world right now. Most people are employed in stuff that ultimately is very repetitive in nature.
Yes.
Will simply be replaced by machines, which means the traditional trickle-down economics model just won't be trickling anymore. So a new paradigm will need to create a new economic paradigm. So what I talk about in my book is before we have a technological singularity, we really need an economic one. And you can see that around us now. People are talking about universal basic income again. They're talking about new models. The pandemic has just seen economies around the world being financed by governments. So the government bankrolling and nationalizing wages around the world. This is just the start of the end, effectively, of the sort of traditional capitalist wave-like model. The danger is what comes next, and that's where I leave the book, which is, the choices we make at this point right now are absolutely critical as the sort of society we move to moving forwards.
Absolutely powerful. My son is 6, so we constantly talk about this. He has now discovered how to use my Google Home. So every now and then the light's on and the kettle is on, and I didn't give it any instructions, but my son is doing that. So it's amazing how quickly he adapts to this technology. But I think, what kind of job will he do one day? What kind of future awaits him? So it's for me, and I think for us, no longer just a armchair, a nice hobby to talk about. This is the future for us and for our children. You speak in your book often about what you call labor-saving devices. I like that. As you take us through the history, if you think of the horse replacing manual human labor plowing the fields, for instance, and so the car and so forth. Now, when we talk about robotic process automation, other things, labor-saving devices, but it almost seems like it's, to your point, labor-replacing devices. I think it's Bostrom in his book that speaks about the creation of the useless class.
Yes.
Also, I think connects with us here. It's as you say, you end your book there, but what do you think are let's call it the two scenarios, depending on what we choose? So what is the optimistic scenario and what's the pessimistic scenario, do you think, given what we choose at the end of the day?
Well, I think there are two very obvious ones, and it's interesting how most of them seem to map to science fiction movies that from the 1980s onwards as to which way they go. There is an Elysium sort of scenario where we have people, the uber wealthy, who effectively, distance themselves in some way. The people who own the machines or own the money, the powers that invest in the machines, creating increasingly gated societies or offshore tax havens, etc. And the rest of the society leaving to its own devices. There is the Chinese scenario, as I could call it, which is, we create compliance through bread and circuses and constant surveillance and control. So we use artificially enabled facial recognition cameras and complete tracking of your online and offline activities to basically control the citizenship, to say, we monitor every aspect of your life and therefore compliance is assured. They're the more dystopian ones. Hopefully the utopian one is that we evolve into a new type of economic paradigm. I don't think it's either socialism or capitalism, but it's some sort of hybrid of the two. Could be a resource-based economy that people have talked about in the past, or some people talk about luxury automated communism where machines do all the work and we sit back, philosophizing that. But the challenge of that, of course, is what do people do with their lives? And I think because purpose, is one of the big things. Most people's purpose in their life was to dig enough food out of the ground in order to feed themselves that night, or to earn enough money in order to feed themselves. Now, if that, even in the utopian scenarios, if that is dealt with, if that is given to us, then what do people do? Where do they find their purpose? Now, there is a million things that you can do with your lives, and the internet proves immediately that you can have access to something that can contains the entirety of human knowledge, and you can use that to educate yourself, teach yourself quantum physics, research history, do whatever. Or you could sit and play Candy Crush all day and Fortnite. And we see that already in society, that there, there is that divide. There is people who, simply want to be entertained, and there are other people who use the opportunity, to go and grow themselves. And in one of the chapters towards the sort of end of my book, I talk about a tale of two mindsets. And I think your mindset of how you take the opportunity will be critical, specifically for the young. And this useless class, I mean, we see most of them protesting on the streets right now. They've come out of university. They think, I'm trying to name the modern day philosopher who calls them the intellectual idiots. They've been through an education, got a liberal arts degree in gender studies or something similar to that. High expectations, low levels of resilience to handle what happens when those expectations aren't met, and no one knows what to do with them anymore. They believe they're owed a high-paying job. There are no high-paying jobs for people with their skills, and they're disenfranchised and they're unhappy, and that's why a lot of them are on the streets right now.
Years and years of study debt to pay off, most likely.
Of course, yeah, exactly. You've got $100,000 worth of study debts, and you're in Starbucks pulling, as a barista.
Yes,
that's not a bright future, And I've got two adult sons myself, and I have this conversation with them all the time, trying to drum into them that the opportunity's there, but it's up to you to open the door.
Absolutely. And what I try and do through this series of video podcasts, Sean, is because for me, my majors when I studied was psychology, sociology, and theology. Mm-hmm. So I obviously there's all the techie, what I call propeller elements of this technology that's very exciting, and cloud and where it's all going, and the power that the increase of processing power and all that. But I think things like how this will impact human spirituality, socially. Our view of ourselves in the future, I don't think we talk about it enough as a whole. So I really want to, in my little way, ignite that in some people, and hopefully there's many, many more. And that's why I was so drawn to your book. It doesn't talk about the tech per se. It talks about all the other human stuff that's important. So I really would like to see more books on that and more podcasts everywhere.
Well, when you get to the latter chapters, there's certainly all the society chapters, the future 6-wave society chapters are all about that, and everything from sort of talking of what I call cracks in the foundations, where we're getting more connected but losing our connections, where we're creating quite a sick society in both a physical sense and a psychological sense, because everything from sort of, diabetes to vitamin D deficiencies, from just the fact that children aren't going outside anymore, they're not doing manual activities, they're sitting on computers, they're not getting sunlight, all the way through to the fact that, just even the sort of characteristics of male humans are disintegrating monsters. The Y chromosomes disintegrating, sperm counts are plummeting, drastically testosterone levels are plummeting. No one knows why. So, we have a huge number of sort of physiological and also psychological impacts to this technology, and it brings great wonder to us. It's fantastic what we can do with it. But as I say in my book, we have amazing technology, but we need the society to be amazed by it. At the moment they're not. A lot of them are dismayed. So I do talk quite a lot about that, and even down to the sort of atomization of individuals that's taking place, because the way the economy has progressed and moved into globalism, those sorts of things. We're atomizing people down. We're removing a lot of the sort of tribal identities that used to create unity and used to create a sense of belonging. Yes. And now what we're seeing is a lot of quite disenfranchised people who have access to technology that would be seen to be magic, as Arthur C. Clarke once declared, by our ancestors, but they've lost their humanity somewhere along the way.
Right. It feels to me, we're more connected than ever through technology, but I and many people I speak to feel less connected.
Yes.
Really, a real connection with others. I also think it's in a developed world where more people are dying of obesity at the moment than from hunger, which, and again, if you go through your historical journey in your book, I knew people were poor in the past, but I didn't realize how poor they were. Until I read some of the things you speak about.
Point. In fact, in my second edition, I make that point in the first part, because I didn't make it clearly enough that if you listen to people who are protesting, for example, constantly now, there's they will protest as because there are people who are poor, but poor is relative. You know, what is poor today is very different to what is poor perhaps. But the one point I've made very clearly is poverty is our default state. Throughout the entirety of human history, poverty is the default. We are born with very little, stroke nothing, and we try to obtain something. And now we've reached a point where the idea of poverty, you know, it's become such an outlier that we're aghast when we actually see it. So, you know, but we have to remember, since the time we've sort of, you know, started walking on two legs, we have had nothing. You know, most people have had nothing. There's only been an incredibly small number of people in society that have had more than enough to basically see themselves through the day. And I use the example, I think, Roundtree's, Sigmund Roundtree's study. And I use York because York's where my son's at university at the moment. And York is an incredibly prosperous, very beautiful town in city, I should say, a cathedral city in North England. But he talked about only 100 years ago how 30% of the population didn't have enough money to buy a stamp to post a letter, or enough money to have the most basic of gruel and food. You know, not one or two, but 30% of the population of town didn't have enough money to buy a newspaper, to buy anything that resembles leisure whatsoever. So that's an enormous increase in our, you know, material wealth in a really small period of time.
Yeah, I think, and then like you say, it is relative. I think for most of us who have a semi-decent job, it's more the inconvenience of not going on your second or third holiday for the year that makes you feel like you're suffering or comparing yourself to peers. But I've never in my whole life wondered, what am I going to eat tonight? I might not be able to have dinner in a restaurant every night, but so I think it's such a mindset change. And you know, after high school, I did some work in the townships here around Johannesburg, and I know you've also been to the country a few times, Sean. And one is exposed to so much more poverty than what you grew up with. And even a lot of those poor people are not as poor as we were 500 years ago, you know, where there was absolutely nothing. Sean, before we end off, I'm obviously going to add to the video comments your website, your social media information, etc. But any interesting webinars or talks coming up over the next few months?
Well, I've got a couple more this week. I'm doing another session tomorrow on supply chain segmentation, more supply chain oriented one. And then I did a webinar on sort of transition point. I did a presentation about a month ago for SAPIX in South Africa. And tomorrow, on Wednesday, I will be doing an hour-long Q&A on that again. So there's an opportunity to ask me anything about the book and about those topics on Wednesday. So yeah.
My aim is by Sunday I'm going to be finished with the book. So it's really been, I'm not just saying it because you're talking to me, Sean, it's been a fantastic read so far.
Very much.
And I look forward to speak more. I think there's so many topics around what we're talking about now that can be expanded. But I'm definitely keen on following your work, and thank you for the opportunity and all the very best for the next few weeks.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Appreciate it.